There's a moment, and I think every soldier who's ever been in real combat knows the one I'm talking about, where everything stops making sense. Not the chaos kind of not making sense. Not the fog of war thing they warn you about in training. I mean the deeper kind. The kind where you're standing in the middle of something so far outside what you thought the universe was capable of, and your brain just refuses to file it properly. That moment hit me on Cathara Station, day 211 of the Vorkai occupation. And it wasn't the Vorkai that broke my understanding of reality. It was the humans. Let me back up, because if I just start from the moment that changed everything, you won't believe it. I barely believe it, and I was there. I have the scars to prove it. My name is Sen Vorath. Was a third-rank field commander in the Tesavian Unified Defense Fleet. The Tesavians are what you'd call a medium-tier galactic civilization. We've had faster-than-light travel for about 400 years. We've fought wars before. Territorial skirmishes with the Dragathi Collective, a nasty little border conflict with the Phoenix Shoal, 2 internal rebellions that history books now call administrative corrections. We knew what war was, or we thought we did. We had trained soldiers. We had energy projection weapons, shielding arrays, tactical computation systems that could model a 12-front battle in under 3 seconds. We had doctrines, manuals, centuries of accumulated military theory. None of it prepared us for the Vorkai. And none of it prepared us for what happened when humanity finally showed up. I should explain what the Vorkai are for anyone reading this who hasn't encountered them. And if you haven't encountered them, count yourself fortunate. Count yourself so fortunate that you should probably go find whatever passes for a religious institution on your world and leave an offering. The Vorkai are old. Not old like the Ethon remnants who have been drifting through dead systems for 60,000 years. Not old like the Silence, which nobody talks about because nobody who talks about the Silence stays around long enough to finish the conversation. The Vorkai are old in the functional sense. They've been fighting wars since before most current civilizations figured out agriculture. They evolved on a planet with 3 apex predator species competing for the same ecological niche, and they were the one that won. Not by being the strongest, not by being the fastest. By being the most relentlessly, comprehensively, almost philosophically committed to the act of destroying things. They don't fight to win territory. They fight to make the other side stop existing. There's no negotiation after engagement. There's no prisoner exchange. There's no ceasefire followed by awkward diplomatic receptions. You fight the Vorkai, you either repel them completely, which almost no one has ever done, or you become one of those civilizations that future archaeologists write about in hushed tones. Cathara Station was ours, had been ours for 230 years. A major transit hub, population around 800,000, civilians, merchants, military personnel, families. The kind of place where kids grew up watching cargo haulers drift in from the outer lanes and dreaming about where those ships had been. The Vorkai wanted it because it sat at the convergence of 3 hyperspace corridors. Take Cathara, and you had a forward staging point that could threaten 12 inhabited systems simultaneously. We knew they were coming. We had 3 months of warning. 3 months to fortify, to evacuate civilians where we could, to request aid from allied civilizations. We sent 247 formal requests for military assistance through every available diplomatic channel. 231 of those requests were declined. The ones that weren't declined were simply never answered. Except one. I wasn't there when the human ship arrived. I was in the lower defensive sectors, coordinating what was left of our southeastern grid after the Vorkai had cut through our outer perimeter like it wasn't even there. It wasn't even there, honestly. We'd built what we thought was a formidable outer defensive shell. The Vorkai walked through it in 9 hours, not because our technology was vastly inferior, though it was somewhat, but because the Vorkai don't fight the way military doctrine says anyone should fight. They don't probe for weaknesses and exploit them. They don't maneuver for positional advantage. They push constantly, everywhere, simultaneously. Imagine fighting a wave. Not a wall of water you can brace against. A wave that finds every crack in the seawall at the same time. That doesn't stop when it hits something. That just keeps pressing until the thing it hits gives way or gets consumed. Our tactical systems couldn't model it properly because our tactical systems were built on the assumption that an enemy has a primary objective they're maneuvering toward. The Volkai's primary objective is everything. Every inch, every corridor, every soldier between them and total control. By day 211, we'd lost 60% of the station's outer ring. We'd lost 22 of our original 38 active defense commanders. My friend Darren Sacco, who I'd served with for 9 years, had died on day 180 trying to hold Corridor 14 against a push that we later found out had been a feint. The Volkai used it as a feint, a coordinated military maneuver designed to draw resources away from their actual line of advance. The species that just pushes everywhere also had tactical sophistication that made our best strategists feel like children playing war games. I was in sub-level 7, trying to eat something that approximately resembled food, when my communications officer Prail pulled off her headset and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in months. Hope. I didn't recognize it at first. We'd gone so long without any reason for it. Commander, she said, the humans are here. Now I need to be honest about something. When she said that, my first reaction was not relief. It was not excitement. It was not the surge of desperate gratitude you might expect from a man who'd been watching his civilization's soldiers die for 7 months. My first reaction was, oh, that's unfortunate for them. Because that's what everyone thought about humans in those days. Not with cruelty, not with contempt exactly. More with the particular sadness you feel when you see something young and eager walking towards something it doesn't understand. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Cooperative for about 60 years at that point. 60 years is nothing. The Tessavians had been spacefaring for 4 centuries, and we were still considered a relatively young civilization by the older species. 60 years was barely long enough to get your seat assignment at the diplomatic table, let alone to be taken seriously in military matters. Humans had fought some wars, yes, among themselves mostly, which the older civilizations found either quaint or alarming, depending on their perspective. They'd had a few border engagements with fringe species since joining the cooperative. Nothing major. Nothing that had really tested them against a genuine galactic military power. The Volkai were not a fringe species. The Volkai were the thing the older civilizations used to frighten each other. And the humans had sent. I looked at the manifest Prail handed me, one ship. One ship. The UNDF Carthage, a vessel class I wasn't familiar with, designated on their registry as a heavy assault carrier. Listed crew complement, 4,200 soldiers, along with something the manifest described as attached rapid deployment units, composition unspecified. 4,000 humans against a Volkai occupation force of approximately 200,000, with reinforcements arriving every 4 to 6 days through the corridors we no longer controlled. I remember thinking, they're going to get everyone on that ship killed and we're going to have to watch it happen, and there's nothing we can do. I remember finishing my food because there wasn't any point in wasting it. The first thing that actually confused me about the humans, the first thing that made me stop and think, wait, something's different here, happened about 6 hours after the Carthage docked at what remained of our primary hangar bay. I was walking through the coordination corridor toward Command Level 3 when I heard them. Not weapons, not equipment, not the tactical briefing you'd expect from soldiers who just arrived in a combat zone and needed to get up to speed on a situation that was, to put it gently, extremely bad. They were laughing. Not nervously, not the thin, brittle laughter people use to cover fear. I know what that sounds like. By day 211, I knew it better than I knew my own name. This was something else. This was loud, unguarded, completely unself-conscious laughter. The kind that happens when something is genuinely funny and nobody's bothering to be professional about it. I stopped in the corridor. There were maybe 40 humans visible from where I stood, near what had been a common area before we'd converted it into a staging zone. They were in partial armor. Their equipment was unlike anything I'd seen, heavier than I'd expected, with a dark matte coating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Some of them were checking weapons. Some were studying holographic maps of the station's interior that our people had shared with them. And some of them were absolutely losing it over something one of their colleagues had said. I caught maybe a third of it. My translator was working but human humor, especially human humor among soldiers who developed their own shorthand over months of shared deployment. That doesn't always survive the translation process intact. Something about a previous mission, a particularly bad piece of military equipment, a malfunction that had apparently been both deeply inconvenient and, in retrospect, hilarious. One of them noticed me watching, a broad human with a shaved head and an impressive collection of visible scars on his forearms. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't straighten up and try to look professional. He grinned at me, actually grinned. "Commander Vorath," he said. His translator had my name right. His voice had an accent I couldn't place, warm, slightly rough around the edges. "Sergeant Major Daku Reyes, sir. You look like you could use some better news." I told him I wasn't sure there was any better news available at this particular moment. He told me I'd be surprised. I told him honestly that I had 200,000 Volkai eating through my station at a rate of approximately 400 meters of territory per day, and that I'd sent requests for help to 247 civilizations and gotten exactly one response, and that response had sent 4,000 soldiers when I needed closer to 400,000. So my capacity for surprise was somewhat limited. He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded like I'd said something completely reasonable. "Yeah," he said, "that's a bad spot. We've been in bad spots before." He paused. "We'll get your station back." He said it the way you'd say something obvious, like he was telling me the chemical composition of water. I didn't know what to say to that. I genuinely didn't, so I nodded and kept walking. Behind me, someone else said something I couldn't quite catch, and the laughter started again. The first joint briefing happened 4 hours later, in what remained of Command Level 3. I had what was left of my command staff, 7 officers, 3 of whom were injured well enough that they should have been in medical instead of at a tactical table. We were exhausted in the specific way that long-term combat exhaustion works, where it's not just your body but your thinking that starts to slow down, where problems that would have had obvious solutions 6 months ago now take twice as long to work through. The humans sent 12 people to the briefing. Their commanding officer was a woman, Colonel Yara Myson, according to her identification. Compact, with close-cropped, gray-streaked hair and eyes that moved constantly, never settling for long. She'd been in military service for 30 years, her file said, though she looked younger than that. Combat deployments in 7 different theaters, 2 of them classified. The other 11 ranged from a very young man who couldn't have been more than 25, and who was taking notes on an actual physical paper document. I hadn't seen anyone use physical paper in a military context in my entire career. To an older woman with no visible rank insignia, who was introduced simply as Dr. Vasquez, and who asked more technical questions about the Volkai engagement patterns than anyone else in the room. Myson let my people talk first. She listened to the full situation briefing, 7 months of data, current territorial losses, casualty figures, supply status, Volkai force estimates, everything without interrupting once. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look frightened by the numbers. She didn't look falsely reassured either. She just listened. When we finished, she was quiet for about 15 seconds. Her eyes moved across the tactical display showing our current territorial status. What we held, what we'd lost. The red areas were significantly larger than the green. "What do you know about their command structure?" she asked finally. My senior tactician, Prel, answered. The Volkai didn't have a command structure in the conventional sense. Their units operated semi-autonomously, with broad directives from central coordination but wide latitude in execution. No single point of failure, no clear chain of command to decapitate. Myson nodded. What about their logistics, supply lines through those 3 corridors? Prel explained what we knew. The Volkai were receiving regular supply and reinforcement through corridors 7, 12, and 19, the 3 main hyperspace approaches to Kethara. We no longer controlled any of those corridors. There was no way to interdict them with our current resources. "What if you had the corridors back?" Myson asked. My officers looked at each other. It was the kind of question that felt almost theoretical at this point. "If we could hold them," Prel said carefully, "we could at minimum stop the reinforcement flow, force the Volkai to fight on what they currently have, but the corridors are." "I know where they are," Myson said. She tapped the tactical display, highlighting 3 specific points. We'll need your technical people to coordinate with mine on the station's internal systems. Gravity generation, atmosphere control, lighting, the stuff that isn't usually considered a weapon. She said that last part the way someone says it when they absolutely intend to use it as a weapon. You want to use the station's environmental systems as a force multiplier, I said. I want to use everything as a force multiplier, she said. That's the approach. She looked around the table. We're not going to fight the Vorkai at their game. 200,000 against 4,000 isn't a fight you win by matching them blow for blow. She paused. So we don't do that? My officer Taryn, the one who, even injured, had the most operational experience of any of us, leaned forward slightly. Then what do you do? Myson glanced at the young man who'd been taking paper notes. He looked up. We make them afraid of the dark, he said. I want to talk about what I saw over the next 72 hours, before the main engagement started. Because I think the actual battle, and we'll get there, I promise, it's the kind of thing you can't rush into without the proper foundation. The actual battle only makes sense if you understand what the humans were like in those 3 days of preparation. The word I keep coming back to, even now, years later, is comfortable. Not comfortable like relaxed. Not comfortable like they weren't taking the situation seriously, but comfortable the way an old craftsperson is comfortable with their tools. The way someone who has done a thing 1,000 times moves through that thing without wasted motion, without visible anxiety, without the kind of performance of confidence that actually reveals insecurity underneath. I watched Sergeant Major Reyes walk a section of disputed corridor territory where we'd had 2 firefights in the past week, with the same physical ease he'd have probably used walking to get food. He was alert. I could see that. His eyes moved the right way, his posture had that specific tension of someone ready to react, but there was no fear in it. Or rather, the fear, whatever was there, had been so thoroughly integrated into his functioning that it no longer looked like fear from the outside. I watched Dr. Vasquez, who turned out to be a xenobiologist with 3 decades of field research, and also apparently an extensive background in what she called conflict ecology, the study of how organisms really fight at the neurological and behavioral level. I watched her spend 6 straight hours reviewing every piece of recorded footage we had of Vorkai combat behavior. She took notes constantly, not on the tablet that would have been normal. On paper with a physical writing instrument, she filled 23 pages. At the end of it, she found me and she said, "They have a tell." I asked what she meant. Every organism that fights has a tell, she said. Something that changes in their behavior or posture when they transition from advanced mode to engaged mode. The Vorkai watch their forward units. There's a specific reorientation that happens about 4 seconds before they shift from coordinated push to direct engagement. It's subtle, but it's consistent. 4 seconds. In a firefight, 4 seconds is an enormous amount of information. I asked how she'd found it. She looked at me the way professors look at students who have asked an obvious question. I watched them, she said. Very carefully. I watched Private First Class Leona Marchetti, 22 years old from a place called Sao Paulo, spend 3 hours teaching a group of my surviving soldiers who had more combat experience than she'd been alive, a particular technique for moving through tight corridors under fire that apparently came from some kind of historical conflict on Earth called urban warfare. The exchange was awkward at first. My people had more years of service than she had years of living. But she taught with a directness and a lack of condescension that got them listening within 30 minutes. By the end, they were practicing the movements. She corrected them with specific, patient precision. When it was done, one of my soldiers, Corporal Dean, who I would not have previously described as someone who expressed emotions in professional settings, told her she was a very good teacher. Marchetti shrugged like it was nothing. I learned from good people, she said. You pass it on. I watched Colonel Myson sleep, which sounds strange, but here's why it matters. She slept for exactly 4 hours at a time she chose strategically, and she slept like a person who had made a deliberate decision to be unconscious and was executing that decision with full commitment. Not the fractured, anxious half-sleep I'd been managing. 4 hours, gone, back, completely present. Like sleep was a tool she deployed rather than something that happened to her. And I watched, this is the one that really got me, I watched the humans sit together in the evenings. Not for tactical purposes, not for briefings or planning, just together, talking. eating whatever they'd brought with them, sharing it, arguing cheerfully about inconsequential things, telling stories about places and people none of the others had ever met. At one point, someone produced a small device that played music and nobody told them to turn it off even though Command Level 3 was still ostensibly a working combat operations center. They weren't pretending the situation wasn't dangerous. They weren't deluding themselves. You could see it in how quickly they shifted when something required attention, how fast the conversation stopped, and the professional precision returned the moment there was actual work to do. It was something else. It was like they had decided, collectively, culturally, at some level below conscious decision, that the darkness didn't get to take everything. That you could be aware of how bad things were and still insist on having moments that belonged to something other than the war. My people had stopped doing that somewhere around day 60. I hadn't even noticed until I saw these humans doing it and felt the ache of what we'd lost. The plan, when Myson laid it out in full on the evening before execution, was not what I'd expected. I'd expected a defensive plan. Something about reinforcing what we held, buying time, maybe extracting more civilians. That's what 4,000 soldiers in a station held by 200,000 Volkai should have been planning. The plan was an attack. Not a desperate counterattack. Not a feint or a diversion. An actual, sequenced, phased offensive operation targeting the Volkai's logistical foundation and designed to, in Myson's words, make their position untenable within 72 hours of initiation. It started with the environmental systems, which her engineers had spent 2.5 days working with my technical people to understand completely. Cathara Station was old enough that its environmental systems had layers, original construction, 2 major renovations, patchwork upgrades over 2 centuries. And those layers meant that someone who understood the architecture could create effects that the surface-level controls didn't obviously allow for. Lighting control, not just on or off, specific manipulation of spectrum and intensity, calibrated against what Dr. Vasquez had identified about Volkai visual systems. Their eyes were adapted for a specific band of light common to their homeworld. In that band, they saw exceptionally well. Outside it, particularly in what translated to the red end of the visible spectrum, their visual processing degraded significantly. Gravity control. The station's gravity generation was decentralized, one of those old redundant systems design choices that had seemed quaint but turned out to be relevant. Individual sections could be adjusted, not to 0, that would have affected systems throughout the station, but to 70% of standard, 80%, calibrated in specific patterns, changed in specific sequences. Atmosphere control. Specifically the atmospheric composition in sealed sections, adjustable within ranges that were breathable for Tesavians and humans, but suboptimal for Volkai respiratory systems. None of these were weapons in the conventional sense. None of them alone would stop a Volkai soldier. But stacked, coordinated to hit simultaneously in the areas of planned engagement. They created conditions that favored human and Tesavian physiology over Volkai physiology. We're not trying to stop them with this, Myson explained. We're shaving their operational efficiency. 5% here, 8% there. Their soldiers push at 100%. We get them to push at 80. In a sustained engagement, that matters. Then came the corridor operations. The plan divided her 4,000 soldiers into units of 12 to 20. Not the large formations our doctrine favored. Small teams, each one with a specific objective, a specific route, a specific timeline. They would move through the station's maintenance corridors and secondary access routes, paths the Volkai had not prioritized because nothing militarily significant had moved through them in decades. The objectives weren't combat objectives, not primarily. They were infrastructure, power relay stations, communication nodes, the specific junction points where the Volkai's coordination system connected to Cathara's own networks, because the Volkai, Dr. Vasquez had identified, were using the station's own systems to partially support their internal communications. It was efficient. It was also a vulnerability, because if you controlled the station systems, you could introduce interference. We're going to make them feel like the station is eating them, said the young man with the paper notes. His name, I'd learned, was Lieutenant Ferris. Not killing them, just making everything harder. Doors that should open, don't. Lights that should work, don't. Information they should have, they don't get when they need it. Small things, 100 small things. I thought about the Vorkai push, that relentless, everywhere, simultaneous pressure. What happened to a wave when it started meeting unexpected resistance? Not a wall it would just destroy, but friction, grit. The kind of resistance that didn't stop it but made every inch cost more than the math said it should. That's a long play, I said. Even if it works perfectly, 72 hours is. The environmental and infrastructure work buys us time, Myson said. While that's happening, we go for the corridors. She meant the hyperspace corridors, 17, 12, and 19. I looked at the tactical display. The corridors were deep in Vorkai-held territory at this point. Getting to them would mean moving through areas we'd ceded months ago, fighting through 200,000 soldiers with forces a fraction of the size. The Vorkai aren't expecting an attack, Myson said. They've never needed to. Their push doctrine doesn't account for the defended side going on offense. Their doctrine says the defender tries to hold, tries to build walls, spends resources maintaining defensive perimeters. She paused, looked at the display. We're not going to do that. We're going to let them push, and while they're pushing, we're going to go around them. I need to stop here for a moment because I want to be honest about something I felt that evening after the briefing, when I was alone with my thoughts for the first time in what felt like days. I was afraid they were going to die. Not in the abstract way you fear for soldiers going into a dangerous situation. I mean specifically, concretely afraid that I was going to watch 4,000 humans, people who had arrived laughing, who had brought music and shared food and taught my people how to move through corridors, who had looked at an impossible situation and said, "We'll get your station back," with the calm certainty of someone discussing the weather. I was going to watch them get consumed by the Vorkai the same way the Vorkai had consumed everything else. And I didn't think I could take it. Not because I was attached to them, though in 72 hours somehow I had become attached to them. But because hope is a dangerous thing to carry in a war zone, and these people had handed me some without asking whether I wanted it. And if they died taking it back with them, I wasn't sure what would be left. I thought about the laughter in the corridor on that first day. The grinning sergeant major, the colonel who slept 4 hours and woke up fully present, the young woman teaching my experienced soldiers techniques they didn't know they needed. I thought, whatever happens, these are a strange and extraordinary people. Then I went back to work because there wasn't anything else to do. The operation began at 300 station time. I wasn't with the assault teams. I was in the revised command post. We'd moved it 3 times in the past week to stay ahead of the Vorkai advance, coordinating the station's environmental and infrastructure systems with Myson's technical team. It was not the position I would have chosen. I'm a field commander by inclination, sitting at a tactical display while other people do the fighting goes against every professional instinct I have. But Myson had been direct about it. "You know this station better than anyone on my team. You're more valuable here than you are in a corridor with a weapon." It wasn't flattery. It was an assessment. She was right, and I knew it, which is the only thing that made sitting there bearable. The first hour was quiet. Not quiet like nothing was happening. The Vorkai push was ongoing, as it had been for 7 months, grinding against our remaining defensive lines with the same relentless pressure. But quiet in the sense that the operation was in its infiltration phase and nothing visible was changing yet. I watched the station system readouts. Watched the human teams moving through the maintenance corridors, small green indicators on a schematic that barely did justice to what was actually happening. Each indicator was a group of people moving through tight, dark, decades-old access tunnels, moving quietly, moving carefully, toward objectives that required them to traverse territory the Vorkai owned. The first contact report came at 3:47. Team Glacier, 12 soldiers, tasked with the primary power relay in Section 44, had run into a Vorkai patrol that wasn't on any pattern we'd observed. 4 Vorkai soldiers moving through a maintenance access route that, according to all our intelligence, they had no reason to be using. The contact lasted 19 seconds. Then Team Glacier reported the route clear and requested guidance on the fastest alternate path to their objective. 19 seconds. The Vorkai patrol had been 4 soldiers. Seasoned, combat-hardened, the kind of soldiers who'd fought their way through Kethara's outer defenses like those defenses were paper. And Team Glacier, 12 humans, moving through enemy territory in the dark, had handled it in 19 seconds with no casualties and minimal noise. I stared at that contact report for a moment. Then I forwarded it to Team Glacier's alternate route and moved on. 412, 3 more teams reported contact and resolved. No casualties. One team requested ammunition resupply at a waypoint, handled. 451, the environmental systems went live. In the sections where the Voakai push was heaviest, the lighting shifted. Not to darkness, nothing that abrupt. A gradual, subtle change in spectrum. The gravity adjusted in 3 sections simultaneously, a 2-second drift to 73% before settling at 82. The atmospheric mixture in 2 sealed segments, shifted by the 4% margin Dr. Vasquez had specified. The Voakai kept pushing. Of course they did, they don't stop. But something changed in the engagement reports from our defensive lines. Terran's voice on the command channel, tight and controlled. They're taking longer on the eastern advance. Same pressure, same mass, but the timing between push waves is stretching. I checked the readouts. The environmental changes were working. Not dramatically, it wasn't like the Voakai suddenly couldn't fight. But they were operating at a fraction less efficiency, and in a sustained engagement, a fraction mattered. 523. Team Meridian, 18 soldiers, Corridor 17, objective, reported they were in position. Corridor 17 was one of the 3 hyperspace approach corridors. The Voakai had been using it to flow reinforcements into the station approximately every 4 to 6 days. The last reinforcement convoy had arrived 2 days ago. The next was estimated in 48 to 96 hours. Team Meridian's objective wasn't to physically hold the corridor. 18 people couldn't hold a major hyperspace approach against a resupply convoy. Their objective was the corridor's control systems. The navigation beacons, the docking authorization protocols, the automated traffic management systems that a vessel coming in on a scheduled resupply run would automatically interface with. At 5:31, Team Meridian transmitted. Corridor 17 control systems compromised. Implementing protocol. The protocol, as Myson's people had explained it to me, involved reprogramming the corridor's automated systems to broadcast a specific kind of interference. Not a complete blockage, something more subtle. A series of navigation errors, timing conflicts, docking authorization failures that, to an incoming vessel, would look like system malfunctions rather than deliberate interference. Resupply convoys that couldn't get clean docking authorization would, by standard Voakai logistics protocol, wait for the system to resolve before attempting entry. A wait of hours, maybe more. It wouldn't stop the reinforcements forever, it would delay them. And delay in this plan was the mechanism of everything else. At 6:12, Lieutenant Ferris came through on the command channel. He wasn't with the assault teams, he was with me in the command post, coordinating the infrastructure operations. His voice had the quality of someone who is working very hard to be calm. "Commander Vorath," he said, "look at Section 31. Section 31 was deep in Voakai territory. We'd lost it on day 89. I hadn't expected to see anything operationally significant happening there because we had no assets there, or thought we had no assets there. There were 3 green indicators in Section 31. 3 human soldiers, deep in enemy-held territory, having navigated there through routes I could barely follow on the schematic, doing something to the communication relay node that sat at the junction of what had been our secondary command network. I watched the indicators for about 15 seconds. They were stationary. Whatever they were doing it carefully. Then all 3 indicators moved simultaneously, smooth and purposeful, heading toward an extraction route. And the communication picture in the Voakai-held areas began to develop small, persistent gaps. Not blackouts, nothing so obvious that the Voakai would immediately identify a deliberate attack. Small delays, packets of data that took 3 times as long to route as they should. Coordination requests that sat in queues for seconds longer than normal before resolving. The Voakai push, by 700, was measurably less coordinated than it had been at midnight. Not by much, not enough on its own to stop them, but the math was changing. Slowly, incrementally, in ways that wouldn't be obvious to someone in the middle of it but were very visible from a command overview. I found myself leaning forward over the tactical display, watching numbers change, watching patterns shift. Feeling, for the first time and I genuinely couldn't remember how long, like the situation had variables I could work with. At 7:43, everything got complicated. Team Solstice, 24 soldiers, the largest human unit deployed, tasked with the secondary power node in the station's central spine, ran into something that hadn't been on any of our intelligence assessments. The Volkai had a reserve force. Not their regular rotation. A separate unit, positioned in the central spine in what looked like, from what Team Solstice's field commander was describing, a deliberate blocking position. Like they'd anticipated someone trying to move through that route. I felt my stomach do something unpleasant. "How many?" I asked. The field commander's voice was even, no panic, just assessment. "Hard to get a full count, estimate 60, 70. They're dug in. 60 to 70, Volkai in a prepared defensive position against 24 humans, in the middle of a covert operation, that absolutely could not afford to turn into a visible pitched battle in the station's central spine. "Hold position," I said. I was already pulling up alternatives on the schematic, trying to find another route to the secondary power node that didn't go through the central spine. There wasn't one, not one that Team Solstice could reach in time. I reported to Myson. Her response took about 4 seconds, which was the longest I'd ever seen her take to respond to something. "Give me the full schematic of that section," she said. "And get Dr. Vasquez." What Dr. Vasquez suggested, when she'd looked at Team Solstice's sensor readings from outside the blocking position, made my technical officer Prell stare at her for a full 3 seconds before saying, That's not something we've ever tried." "Most things humans try weren't tried before," Vasquez said, pleasantly, like this was a conversation about cooking rather than combat tactics in a live operational scenario. The Volkai in that blocking position were dug in. They had good fields of fire. They had prepared cover. A direct assault by 24 soldiers against 60 to 70 prepared defenders was, by every tactical calculation in every military manual I had ever studied, exactly the wrong thing to do. So Vasquez proposed doing something that wasn't in the manual. The central spine of Cathara Station ran through 4 atmospheric zones, environmental sections with slightly different atmospheric compositions, a legacy of how the station had been built in phases over 2 centuries. The transitions between zones were normally seamless. The environmental systems blended them so no one noticed moving between zones. Unless the environmental systems were told not to blend them. The Volkai blocking position sat right at the boundary between Zone 2 and Zone 3. Their soldiers were positioned in Zone 2, which had standard atmospheric composition. Zone 3, adjacent, was a former industrial section. Its atmospheric systems were capable of running a significantly different gas mixture, one that was still breathable for Tesavians and humans, but that Volkai respiratory physiology processed as mildly irritating, not incapacitating, not even significantly harmful over short exposures, but significantly distracting. More importantly, Zone 2's lighting systems, unlike most of the station's illumination, ran on an older infrastructure that still responded to full-spectrum control, including the specific spectrum ranges that Volkai visual processing depended on most heavily. If you dropped the right frequencies in Zone 2 at the same time, you pushed Zone 3's irritant atmosphere backward into Zone 2, creating about 90 seconds of degraded visual processing and mild respiratory distraction for the Volkai in that blocking position. And if Team Solstice moved in that 90-second window with the specific techniques Marchetti had been teaching, moving low, moving fast, using the cover differently than Tesavian doctrine would have placed them. "It's a window," Vasquez said. "Not a solution. You give them a window and they take it." Myson was listening on the channel. "Team Solstice," she said, "do you copy this?" Team Solstice's commander said yes. She asked if they understood what they were being asked to do. He said, and I will remember this forever, "We understand. We're ready when the window opens." Not we'll try, not we'll do our best. We're ready. I initiated the environmental sequence at 8:01. The lights in Zone 2 shifted. The atmospheric blend in Zone 3 reversed its direction of flow. Team Solstice moved. I couldn't see it. I was watching indicators on a schematic. I was watching system readouts. I was listening to the compressed, efficient radio traffic of soldiers doing something in real space that I could only see as numbers and positions on a screen. But I've reconstructed it since. I've talked to the soldiers who were there. I've seen the after-action footage from their equipment. Let me tell you what actually happened in those 90 seconds. The Volkai in that blocking position were experienced soldiers. Even with visual processing degraded and a mild atmospheric irritant cutting at their focus, they were experienced, armed, and alert. They didn't stop being dangerous because the lights changed. Team Solstice knew that. What they did, what they'd apparently practiced, had training and instinct built around, was the kind of movement that didn't try to pretend the enemy wasn't dangerous. It assumed the enemy was dangerous. It moved in ways that made the enemy's danger work against itself. The team's structure split immediately, not into two groups, into seven. 7 elements moving through different approach lines simultaneously, each one taking different cover positions, each one moving at slightly different timing, so the Volkai defenders couldn't establish a coherent fire pattern on any single line of advance. The Volkai, dealing with degraded vision and the atmospheric distraction, tried to track all 7 lines at once. Their coordination, already fraying from the communication interference running through the rest of the station, took too long to establish a unified response. 6 of the 7 elements were suppressing, not advancing, drawing attention, drawing fire, drawing the defender's focus. The 7th element, 4 soldiers, moving so low they were practically on the deck, using a route along the wall that the Volkai hadn't fully covered because it was tactically suboptimal from a conventional approach angle, reached the edge of the blocking position in 61 seconds. The close-range engagement that followed lasted 40 seconds. When it was over, the blocking position was clear. Team Solstice had 3 wounded, none critically. "Position clear," the team commander reported, continuing to objective. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out. Next to me, Lieutenant Ferris was doing something with his hands. I think it was what humans call wringing one's hands, a stress gesture, except he'd switched to a data tablet and he was gripping it too hard. He noticed me noticing and loosened his grip. "They're good at this," he said, not boastfully, almost like he was reminding himself of something he sometimes needed to remember. "Yes," I said, "they are." By 1100, Team Solstice had reached the secondary power node. By 1127, they'd accomplished their objective. By 1215, all active teams had either completed their primary objectives or were in controlled withdrawal back through the maintenance corridors. The station felt different. I don't know how else to describe it. The Volkai push was still ongoing. It didn't stop. That was never the plan. Stopping it in hours wasn't possible. But it felt different. The quality of it had changed. The coordination gaps were visible now even to my defensive line commanders, who were reporting it with a kind of cautious bewilderment. The Volkai were still pressing, still dangerous, still capable of grinding through defensive lines if given enough time. But the seamless, relentless synchronization that had made their advance feel almost inevitable was developing faults. Small faults, the kind of faults that a week ago I would have dismissed as tactically insignificant. Now I understood what Myson had meant. 5% here, 8% there, small things, 100 small things adding up. At 1340, Corridor 17 reported its first effect. A Volkai resupply convoy had arrived at the corridor's approach, interfaced with the automated systems, received the cascade of navigation errors and docking failures, and exactly as predicted, settled into a holding pattern outside the corridor rather than attempting manual approach. They weren't blockable indefinitely. Eventually, someone in their command would send a technical team to look at the corridor systems, find the interference, clear it. That would take time, and buying time was what this was about. The convoy sat in holding. I reported it to Myson. She said, "Good. How's our eastern defensive line holding?" There's a moment I want to tell you about that happened at 1500 that I think matters more than any of the tactical developments. The human teams were cycling back through command post for resupply and brief rest rotations. Not all of them, the operation was still running, but elements of each team were cycling through. I was in the command post monitoring systems when Sergeant Major Reyes came through with 6 members of Team Glacier. They were dirty, combat zone dirty, the kind that settles into armor plating and skin and hair over hours of moving through maintenance corridors and engaging enemies. Reyes had a field dressing on his left forearm that hadn't been there yesterday. He came straight to the coffee, or rather, to whatever close approximation of it the humans had brought with them. Some kind of concentrated hot liquid they drank with a seriousness that suggested it was culturally significant. He poured a mug. Then he poured another one and set it in front of one of my officers, Taryn, who had been awake for 22 hours straight without being asked. Taryn looked at the mug, looked at Reyes. "It's not what you're used to," Reyes said, "but it helps." Taryn drank it, made a face, drank the rest of it anyway. Reyes sat down across from me with his own mug. The tiredness was visible now. The operation had been running for 15 hours, and while these were very capable soldiers, they were also still biological beings with biological limits. But the tiredness hadn't changed the fundamental quality I'd noticed from the beginning. The comfort, the presence. "Your station's a good station," he said. "Good bones. The people who built it knew what they were doing." I said something about it being 230 years old, that a lot of hands had shaped it. "Yeah," he said, "you can feel that." He paused. "My grandmother had a house like that, old place outside Lagos. Every generation added something. You could see it in the walls if you knew how to look." I didn't know what Lagos was. I didn't ask. The texture of what he was saying didn't require the geography. "You think this works?" I asked. It wasn't the kind of question a commander should ask. It was the kind of question that came out anyway at hour 15 when the guard is down a little. He turned the mug in his hands, considered. "I think we gave ourselves a fighting chance," he said. "That's usually what you can give yourself. The rest is how well you use what you've built." "That's not exactly a guarantee." "No," he agreed, "but you weren't going to get a guarantee anyway. You were going to get what you made of the situation." He glanced at the tactical display. "Looks to me like you've got better options now than you had yesterday." I thought about it. He was right. Not dramatically right. The Vorkai were still in my station, still grinding, still dangerous. But the options had changed. The variables had shifted in ways that, a day ago, I hadn't thought possible. "Your people are extraordinary," I said. It came out more directly than I'd intended. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not pride exactly. Something older and more complicated than pride. "They're human," he said. "Same as everyone. They're scared and tired and they miss their families and they're doing the best they can with what they've got." He drank his coffee. "That's all it's ever been, really. People doing the best they can with what they've got." I thought about 231 civilizations who had declined to respond. I thought about the one that had sent 4,000 people. "It matters," I said, "that you came." He nodded, not like he was dismissing it, like he understood exactly what I meant and was accepting it, and choosing not to make it larger than the moment required. "Yeah," he said, "we try to show up." By the end of day 211, the operation was still running. The station was still contested, the Vorkai were still pushing. But Corridor 17 was functionally closed for Vorkai resupply. Corridor 12's control systems were 2 hours from compromise. Corridor 19 had an active human element in position. The Vorkai's coordination was operating at a measurable deficit. Not enough to stop them, but enough to slow the rate of territorial advance to less than half of what it had been at the beginning of the week. Our defensive lines were holding. Not just holding, my commanders were beginning, cautiously, experimentally, to talk about positions we might be able to take back. 3 months later, we would reclaim Cathara Station. The battle that made it possible, the full operation, parts 2 through 6, is more than one night's telling. It involved things I saw that I'm still working to properly understand. Human soldiers doing things in combat that I categorized as impossible until I saw them doing it. Tactics that existed outside every framework I'd been taught. Moments of bravery that went so far past bravery into something I don't have a good word for that I'm not sure the concept exists in Tessavian. But it started here, on day 211, with 4,000 people who arrived laughing, who shared their coffee, who taught techniques and listened carefully and slept 4 hours and woke up completely present, who looked at impossible odds and said we'll get your station back without a single note of false bravado in their voice. The Vorkai had never faced them before. Most civilizations never had. And the thing I've realized in the years since, the thing I couldn't have articulated then, standing in that command post, watching green indicators move through dark corridors toward objectives we'd thought were beyond reach, is that it wasn't really about the tactics. The tactics were extraordinary. The planning was extraordinary. The execution was more extraordinary than I can adequately communicate in words. But the Volkai had never been afraid before. That was the truth of it. They'd never encountered something they couldn't push through or around or over, never met an opponent who looked at the Volkai way of war and instead of trying to match it or avoid it, looked at it and said, "Interesting problem, let's think about this differently." The Volkai were old at war. The humans were young at space. But they were ancient at something else, at surviving, at adapting, at finding a way through things that had never been meant to have a way through them, at looking at an enemy who had been fighting since before most civilizations discovered agriculture and not being defeated by the idea of it. I asked Myson once, later, what had made her think the plan would work. She thought about it for a moment, in that considered way she had. "I didn't know it would work," she said. "No one ever knows that. You understand the problem, you find what angles you have, you make the best plan you can, and then you execute it like you believe in it." She paused. The believing matters, not because it changes the odds, but because it changes how you work within the odds, and how you work within them is often the difference. I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about the 231 civilizations who declined to respond. I've thought about what kind of math they were doing when they made that decision, what odds they calculated, what conclusion they reached that made sending anyone seem pointless. And I've thought about the one civilization that sent 4,000 people to a fight where 200,000 waited for them. And those 4,000 people arrived laughing. And they looked at the numbers and they made a plan anyway. And they executed it like they believed in it. And they were right too. Nothing prepared me for war. Not training, not doctrine, not 9 years of service. Not the years I'd spent thinking I understood what conflict was and what it asked of you. Nothing prepared me for war. Until humanity entered the battlefield. And then I understood something I hadn't understood before. That preparedness isn't really about the war you've already trained for. It's about whether, when something entirely new arrives, you can look at it clearly and find something in yourself that the situation didn't know you had. The humans knew that, had always known it, I think. It was written into them at a level below conscious knowledge, the way certain truths get written into a species by enough centuries of having to figure things out under pressure. You show up. You do the best you can with what you've got. And sometimes, not always, not without cost, not without the kind of losses that leave marks that don't heal cleanly, sometimes that's exactly enough.